Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us at our latest Smart Cities Talk Series event. Today we have Dr. Geoff Boeing, an assistant professor in USC's Department of Urban Planning and Spatial Analysis, the director of USC's Urban Data Lab, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Professor Boeing's research revolves around city planning, urban form, and geospatial data science. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to present, Dr. Boeing. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Connor, for the invitation and introduction. I appreciate it. And so just to confirm, we've got like around 30 minutes to talk today. Is that right?
Generally, yeah, around that.
Okay, cool. That's what I had in mind. I'm going to aim for something shorter than that, so we have a little bit of time to chat back and forth here as well. But today I'm going to be talking about some recent work that I've been doing. And I'm going to aim for this to be a little bit more of kind of like an overview or agenda talk rather than just like, here's a single paper I'm doing. And it's kind of because a lot of this is evolving right now as we go. In this space of the digitalization of the housing search. So essentially looking at what happens to how people find and advertise housing when housing markets increasingly move online. And so we're going to be framing this around these themes of home seeking, gatekeeping in the market, and then market legibility, both for those people participating in the market itself, but also for planners and policymakers who are trying to understand market conditions and intervene into housing crises. So all of this today is going to be framed around these couple of questions here. So does this process of digitalization in our housing markets result in more equal access to information with fewer gatekeepers? So it's kind of like the promise of digitalization in an information landscape. Or do you end up with inequitable costs and benefits that tend to reproduce traditional information inequalities in the housing market? And the problem is right now, we don't really know. And unfortunately, we don't really know because the answer is almost surely that it's a little bit of both. So the question that I have is, for whom do we see the benefits and for whom do we see the costs? That is, if we do see this equalization of information, is it equalization for everybody, or is it a little bit lumpy? So some background on that. I mentioned earlier that that promise of digitalization is kind of like a democratization of information in the housing market. The idea behind that promise is that rental housing markets has, as you all know, increasingly moved online in recent years. The 2019 American Housing Survey was the first time that in urbanized areas, more renters used websites like Craigslist to find their current home than any other information channel. So in the past 5 years, this has kind of become the norm in housing markets beyond just what had been the norm for probably 15 years prior to that among young people in particular. Now almost everyone is participating in this. As it's done that, there have been a set of new platforms that have dominated that information exchange. So sites like Craigslist, Facebook. In Los Angeles, there are specialist platforms like Westside Rentals. We tend to see similar things in Chinatown neighborhoods in different cities or in Latino neighborhoods where there are information-specific platforms for speakers of a certain language. But at the end of the day, there's a small set of platforms operating in a dominant way in these spaces. And that information landscape of those online listings has played into these conversations around techno-utopianism about the democratization of data. Is this just wishful thinking? And, there's some questions about the extent to which we can use technology to mitigate racialized urban interactions. So there's this question here about benefits and drawbacks and for whom. So the benefits, the promise of digitalization has 5 key points. So the first is that on a digital housing market, you're able to target much more specific niches. That is, it's really hard to target both your listings and your housing search without these digital information exchanges. Instead, you're kind of driving around neighborhoods, looking for apartments that match what you need, or you're looking in a newspaper manually trying to find that information, or you're relying on your social networks, talking with people to see if they have any leads about, a 4-bedroom apartment because you got 3 kids, or an apartment that allows large dogs because you have a large dog. It's really hard to target those niches without this kind of process of digitalization. The second thing that it offers is a diversification of information supplies. What that means is rather than these sort of geographic silos that we would often exist within, you're able to look at a much broader range of information if you're searching online. And that plays into the third point here. In doing so, we're often able to drastically expand our choice sets and our search radii as we're searching if we're able to participate in online digital information exchange like Craigslist or Facebook. That is, there's a lot more stuff available to us, and we're able to look a lot further because of it. And then fourth, because we're able to so easily expand those choice sets by searching online, we're in turn able to reduce our search costs and ideally some of the information asymmetries that exist in the housing market. And then lastly, and following from that, the goal here, a lot of the time, is to try to diminish the role that traditional gatekeepers like agents or brokers have historically played in the housing market. So by that role, I'm referring to some of the negative effects like racialized steering or sorting of certain house seekers into certain markets or housing units. Now, all of these data in a digital housing information exchange represent very often a key profit center for major corporations, but they also offer a public good, more equal access to information. So in the housing search, this public good is very often threatened by the private nature of what is often a digital infrastructure controlled by an oligopoly of companies. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, there are a few problems here that we've started to see a little bit of empirical evidence for. So first, it could be that privileged communities will utilize these digital tools more, and in turn, they will receive the benefits of digitalization. Second, and related to that, there could also be information channel self-segregation. That is, maybe everyone uses these tools for digital housing searches, but they use different tools in different communities. So maybe rich people use one set of tools. Middle class white families use a different set of tools. Chinese Americans use a different set of tools, and Latino immigrants use a different set of tools. Well, maybe these different communities prefer those different housing search information channels for different reasons, and very valid reasons a lot of the time around language or familiarity with different technology. And we know that internet usage differs between different demographic groups. So while the internet offers information democratization as a promise to information disadvantaged households, those kind of personal biases and self-segregation patterns could reproduce the long-standing information inequalities that have always existed in the housing market as these new digital inequalities. And that presents a sort of modern form of steering. That is, information channel segregation could accelerate residential segregation. In addition to that, there are obviously privacy concerns about what we're sharing about ourselves online. And at the end of the day, you have these processes of new gatekeepers emerging, particularly in home sharing arrangements, which I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes, where tenants themselves very often act as gatekeepers online for who gets to live in which housing units. So at the end of the day, the concern is that a lot of this promise of democratization of information could really be the sort of faux democratization. That is, it has the trappings of democratization, like decentralization, but without a lot of the benefits of democratization. So instead, you have these information channels themselves that are controlled by oligopolies and being sorted into in very unequal ways. So a few questions from that. First off, what do we actually know about these platforms used today? That is, do we see equal use among different ethnic or income levels? In turn, who actually benefits from the digitalization of housing search information? Who could actually be harmed by this? And then kind of a broader theoretical and policy practical implication question is how can we try to balance at a societal level some of those benefits and harms that could be coming out from this? So with those questions in mind, there are three key currents here that me and my research teams have been looking at. First is about this role of information broadcasting. That is how we transmit this information and who receives it. And the second is about non-traditional residential mobility. That is, the digitalization of the housing search can in turn unlock very different forms of residential mobility we've historically seen in cities. And then last is shifting power dynamics. So the roles of gatekeepers as gatekeeping changes in very drastic ways when we move online. So for the first one, information broadcasting. So the traditional market has been all about personal relationships. That is those social networks, about who you know, who you hire as your agent or broker, and those kind of private connections. That is, it's been a lot of inside baseball about who we're able to connect in housing market searches, and who has access to this kind of information. And a lot of it has been dependent on physical proximity. So historically, you would need access to some local pieces of information which required physical proximity to local newspaper classified ads or to the neighborhoods themselves to walk or drive around looking for rent signs or for sale signs. So the digital market has changed all of that, where we can now exchange information in public channels that anyone can see. The question is, do we all have access to that same information landscape, or does information quantity and quality reflect sociodemographics and historical information inequalities in the housing search? That is, can we escape those socio-structural factors that have always shaped our search geographies? That is, who we know, where we were born, the neighborhoods we're familiar with, the networks that we have. Or can we try to use these tools to overcome the racial steering and gatekeeping that were so often part and parcel with agents and brokers intervening in the search? Unfortunately, the recent empirical evidence that my team has been finding has been fairly mixed. It really hasn't come to match with that promise of digitalization. So what we found, in short, is that home seekers in whiter, wealthier, better educated, and more expensive communities have an information surplus available to them online to help them in their housing searches. Other communities have conversely faced an information deficit of far less information online for their housing searches. And that's perpetuated the historical patterns that have always existed in the housing market. In particular, listings in communities with more Black, Latino, or poorer residents, all else equal, contain less information. And what information does exist disproportionately focus on tenant disqualifications rather than unit characteristics or location amenities. So what we're seeing here is the benefits accruing to already advantaged communities and disadvantaged communities missing out on those benefits. So here, this information channel segregation and asymmetry within it reproduce traditional information inequalities and limit processes of residential integration. Now, this is focused here on the rental market. These kind of effects in the buying market are much more muted due to the existence of the MLS. So what we've been wondering coming out of that is, do these information inequalities that we see really serve to be inequalities with harms? Or is it possible to think about this as almost a redoubt of digital illegibility? That is, if certain disadvantaged communities are hidden in these online listings and information exchanges, might that limit the discovery or colonization by higher socioeconomic status communities? That is, could it thwart processes of gentrification if it makes them less discoverable through the processes that outsiders often use to discover housing in unfamiliar neighborhoods? And we're not sure yet. It's an open question. And so our second current here was thinking about that idea of non-traditional residential mobility. And there are two forms here that it could take. So the first is economic mobility could be changed through long distance housing searches. That is, traditionally, we had this highly localized knowledge shaping the housing search. But today, if that information is instead being publicly broadcast, this could reduce a lot of the challenges of intermetropolitan moves and immigration because you have better access to information in unfamiliar markets. In turn, you may have better access to opportunities and labor market matching that didn't exist before, and it was much harder to render an unfamiliar housing market legible to you as a home seeker. And this has a lot of implications too for these sort of diasporic networks, where people will be able to rely on family or cultural ties to understand an information landscape in a housing market versus these new and emerging ethnic, cultural, or language specific platforms. And in particular, non-English platforms are a huge research gap in this space that hasn't been fully tapped into. So then our second form of non-traditional residential mobility that we're interested in is shared housing. So that is when you share a housing unit with other tenants, in particular beyond student housing or traditional family-based social systems and safety nets. So in the past few years, demographic trends, labor trends, and obviously unaffordability trends in places like Austin or Los Angeles have made home sharing much more attractive to people in the housing market. Um, when you do engage in home sharing, one of the interesting things that when you're doing it with strangers is you're not only matching on, say, unit and locational characteristics, but you're also matching on personal characteristics. What that means in practice is that tenants start serving as gatekeepers themselves, where you're matching on personality fit, which could be both legitimate because you want to like the kind of people who you're living with, but at the same time, it can perpetuate inequitable status quos as certain online personas or ethnic groups or age brackets are treated as more desirable or treated as more credible as we're exchanging information online or filtering who should live with us. And you can also have more niche offerings or precise matches that become more viable, like the classic 420 friendly rental listings that you see online all the time are a lot easier to signal online than they are in other ways sometimes. And it helps you kind of filter and pool in the housing market to increase the appeal of certain niche offerings, but also increase the pool of sharers in that space. So with that kind of non-traditional housing search and gatekeepers shifting from traditional agents, brokers, landlords, often to other tenants, you're sidestepping old gatekeepers, but at the same time, those old gatekeepers are smart enough to be sidestepping you as well. That is, those agents and brokers are often shifting to new techniques and new strategies to maintain their power over the housing search. And simultaneously, as that's happening, new gatekeepers are arising, either other tenants in a shared housing situation, or new digital companies that are capitalizing on digitalization, offering new interactive experiences in the housing search, 3D online tours that didn't really exist much pre-COVID, and new forms of marketing and staging. In addition to all of that, there are huge problems for algorithmic redlining as well. So we recently saw with the Facebook settlement a few years ago, that is Facebook's algorithms target postings and housing ads to certain people based on their demographic profile. They're often violating the Fair Housing Act and what kind of information those people are seeing. So basically what Facebook does is on a daily basis across their information platform, violates the Fair Housing Act when you do it with housing listing information. So you end up with these new opportunities for discrimination at different stages of the housing search. But you have more information to filter on, both as tenants, but also as prospective landlords. Interestingly, of course, most buyers, it's still like 85 to 90% of buyers still use agents. And very often those agents are race matched. That is, white people are disproportionately likely to choose white housing agents. African Americans, the same for African American agents. And you end up having those kind of information channels get segregated accordingly the same way. So those online platforms make it a lot easier to acquire different kinds of investments as well, like scattered site investment for single family properties. Doesn't cause it, but it certainly makes it easier. iBuying was a huge thing a couple of years ago. It's had a whole bunch of failures in the past couple of years, which have really drawn it into question sometimes. iBuying is a small share of the overall market, but does concentrate in certain cities and neighborhoods. And overall, tech opens up markets to new participants and potentially new kinds of homes and suburbs or different mixes of amenities to certain kinds of renters who may not have had that kind of access in the past. So, in conclusion, I want to come back to that theme of faux democratization that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. So, what we found very often in the research we've been conducting is that online platforms tend to reproduce real world power dynamics. That is, this isn't a techno utopia where we're able to move beyond the way that human beings are. It often just fuels and amplifies and makes what humans do more efficient, for good or for evil. Importantly, these markets are very often segmented, hyperlocal, and entrenched in customs. That is, there are a lot of customs in how we find and list housing. Cover letters sometimes are important in some markets and not in others. What a standard offer looks like is very different in one city than it is in another. Fee responsibility differs. And very often with an online search, you will end up with a false sense of knowledge. That is, you're operating at a disadvantage to agents if you don't know what you don't know. So on one hand, it gives us equal access to information. On the other hand, the parts of the market that remain hyperlocal and custom-based become increasingly invisible to you if you're operating without some of those traditional guardrails, for better or for worse. Very often we end up seeing information asymmetries through self-segregation into different information channels in these markets. And what that means is that technology doesn't change discrimination so much as it shifts the setting of discrimination. That is, we now have automated screenings, making it easier to discriminate. You can pick and choose which tenants you want to live with you. It's kind of shifted how it works without really changing the underlying outcome. So for policymakers, there are a few goals here. The overall picture is we want to obviously foster some of the benefits of digitalization while mitigating some of its harms. Using these kind of data as a sort of exhaust trail of housing transactions, planners and policymakers can try to monitor market conditions in almost real time, but it's important to be wary of the sampling biases we've been talking about. That is, not everyone participates equally here. What we do need to do is develop better guidelines for data collection and privacy. That is, defining what information must or must not be collected in these information exchanges as an important part of equalizing that information landscape across different populations and across different platforms. But there's also a role here for housing advocates to intervene into this process. One thing that me and my colleagues have called for is developing more targeted platforms that incorporate information across platforms to help make choice neighborhoods more legible and more accessible to certain populations that have a hard time accessing that information, either through their own social networks or through traditional gatekeepers like brokers and agents. So these are two questions that I led off with earlier. Do we see more equal access to information with fewer gatekeepers through digitalization? Or do we see inequitable distribution of benefits and costs that tends to reproduce traditional information inequalities? The answer to this is mixed, but it's a little bit of both. So there are information equalizing opportunities here in this digitalization process. But as always, humans have found ways to make it less equitable than it could be. And that gives us a key opportunity here as planners and policymakers to try to intervene to make those information asymmetries less so and focus on more of the democratic benefits of digitalization. So that's it for my talk, but I hope we have a few minutes to chat more about this. Thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Boeing. Yes, we definitely have some time. I can lead us off with a quick question. I'm kind of curious. You mentioned sort of the idea of language specific and cultural specific targeting platforms. Do you believe these will sort of have a place going forward against sort of such large oligarchs like Zillow or Redfin that you had mentioned previously? Do you see these sort of players being able to survive?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, in certain cities, there's a huge market for it. So I'm not sure in Austin, but it may be similar. In Los Angeles, there's apartamentos.com that targets Spanish-speaking home seekers. That has it gives you the information you want, and very often the kinds of neighborhoods where you will have a community that shares culture with you, which is great. But that's exactly information channel self-segregation, and that's exactly the kind of pattern we've historically seen that result in residential segregation. Similarly, in San Francisco's Chinatown, famously, there are almost no housing listings on any of the, say, mainstream platforms like on Facebook or on Craigslist, because they use very different social networks and Chinese language exchanges to share information in that community. Why? Because that's the community that knows the landscape, and they're working internally to share some of those benefits of knowledge about where housing is available. So yeah, I mean, I think those platforms will always continue to exist because they offer that specialization that everyone's always looking for in your own niche. The challenges and the drawbacks are always going to be with self-segregation, but there are benefits to it too, and that's why people do it.
Thank you. Fascinating. I don't know a whole lot about housing, so that's wonderful.
I have one quick question. Thank you, Dr. Boeing, for a wonderful talk. And I really like the term algorithmic redlining. But just wanted to hear more, like what should be the role of planner should be to actually address this kind of target platform issues. I'm pretty sure as you're a researcher in this field, some of us are actually leading some technological side, but eventually we are not a computer scientist, so inherently we can actually compete with those platform optimizations like computer scientists or engineers working on that. But in this sense, while we are having an inherent gap in knowledge and perhaps also power, how should like future planning scholars and practitioners be prepared and intervene to mitigate this digitalization issue?
That's a really good question. So the way I'll answer it is by saying that I wouldn't want to limit it to just us as planners, but rather think about people who operate in the housing space. So planners play a key role in that. But adjacent to planning is policy making, and adjacent to that is the legal landscape as well. I think part of this is about regulation and legal protections to make sure that we don't have algorithmic redlining, for example. We're seeing some moves in that direction, like with the recent Facebook settlement for violating the Fair Housing Act. But in addition to that, a couple of things planners can do to take advantage and to try to make this a better environment. So first, there's a lot of information being passed in these information exchanges that planners just aren't tapping into. But it can give you a good real-time pulse on affordability, current housing market conditions. It gives you kind of an advanced signal of gentrification taking place. Being able to understand what asking rents look like in almost real time is often a lot more powerful than just looking at time-lagged contract rents or gross rents from, say, the ACS or the American Housing Survey, that don't really tell you much about what housing costs look like for someone seeking housing today in a rapidly changing neighborhood in a high-demand city. So tapping into that can really help us understand much more proactively about affordability conditions and neighborhood change. Secondly, when we think about how to make a better platform, you're right, we can't necessarily compete with profit incentivized tech companies, and there's no way to. But what we can do is instead try to make it a bit of a bigger tent. So rather than building the best platform that's out there, we could work with tech companies to say, if you want to operate in our city, we want you to make sure that the data are all made publicly available. It goes into this clearinghouse that we have created. And, it's not for planners to do, but planners can certainly hire someone or do a code-a-thon or a Code for America kind of project to take a couple of months to set up, a database with a user interface on top of it that integrates listings from otherwise information segregated channels to give people a single common source of information. And then secondly, as advocates, working with these communities to help them tailor their housing searches. So one thing you can do on any platform is teach people how to search smarter. So rather than searching within the neighborhood where I currently live, which is the only neighborhood I've ever known because I grew up here, and it's the only neighborhood that anyone I know knows anything about, if we could search instead on unit characteristics or teach people to search based on amenity mixes, we can very often break out of those geographic silos using existing tools in a way that is often very unfamiliar for people who aren't used to being able to perform those kind of housing searches.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
Geoff,
you.
it's very nice to meet you, and sorry for the delay. I was in other meeting, just finished join. Wonderful talk.
Thanks.
I've kind of related question. So you see, this tech companies trying to penetrate a local housing market. We saw it from Zillow, we saw it from Redfin, by providing online agent to sell or buy house. Also feel there's a strong pressure or protection or urgency from local real estate developer or agent to protect their turf. So my question to you is, in the long run, do you think the housing market will be completely digitalized or like commercialized like we saw in other domains like transport, maybe not transportation, but other, I have to find a good domain, but do you think a tech company or smaller tech company will penetrate local markets and take, like say 80% online, 20% in person? Do you think this will
That's a good question. So in general, the way I usually think about these processes of technology in the city
Mhm.
is that as long as it's about something that's physical, like a physical human need, there's never going to be like a full death of distance. When COVID-19 happened, it was finally time for all those 90s predictions of IT causing like the death of cities to finally come true, right? Now that we can all use Zoom, we don't have to be in person anymore. You don't have to live in crowded, noisy, expensive, dirty cities. But it didn't really happen, did it? I mean, the bottom line is, I mean, that one's a really good example of the physical need because people will still want to be around each other because we want social interaction. People will want to have sex, and these things don't change. You have to be in the same city as each other, within proximity of each other. There are other things like email. We can always move online because we don't have to be face to face to send a message. The housing search is one of those really physical things. If you think about like the Maslow hierarchy of needs, the housing search is to satisfy your shelter need. And for that reason, there's a certain amount of physical presence that has to happen. I bought a house during COVID and I did a lot of like the 3D online tours, trying to see what different places looked like. And that helped me filter down the places that I would visit in person. But I had to go visit it in person and I had to work with a local agent because Zillow, Redfin could never tell me about, especially in a place like Los Angeles, the quality of the foundation that was built in 1926 on this hillside in an earthquake-prone city and what that would mean for when the big one would hit, or things like the quality of the plumbing or the electrical work in the house. let alone just the simple things about, will my son's bedroom be big enough that he can have like a desk to do his homework on? So yes and no. I think what digitalization will replace a lot of the time in the housing search are those first one, two, or three filtering steps, often increasing the number of places you can see and then filtering down the ones that won't be a good fit for you. But I think anything that satisfies a physical human need will always have that local in-person process after an initial digital process.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Boeing. Thank you so much for your great talk. I have some questions about like the urban system or the urban form for the like the housing market modeling or like the urban mobility modeling. Since we are getting a huge amount of data with different formats and like it can provide us almost every aspects of the urban. So we also have the deep learning models or algorithms help us to like fuse this data and extract useful information from this data. So my question is like, how do you think the pre-knowledge of the urban form or the urban system could help us to build such a foundation model for the urban like the housing market modeling or like the urban mobility modeling? Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess that's kind of the goal of the digital twin line of research of trying to make these one-to-one models of urban systems. It's kind of funny, in the past couple of years, the number of things being called a digital twin model is not commensurate with the number of things that are actually digital twin models. There's an awful lot of room for fudging what one-to-one means here, and I don't think people are doing it quite right a lot of the time, but digital twin research gets published. So in terms of deep learning, the funny thing with a lot of that kind of, inductive modeling that deep learning offers to us is it lets us shift where human interpretation comes into play, from say like the old-fashioned but still very valid like scientific method of here's my theory, here's my research question, here's my hypothesis, here's my OLS model to test the hypothesis. There's a lot of human interpretation going in there. And it's different than if you just throw in a really, really large feature space into a deep learning model and you say, help me find patterns in this. Post hoc, you're still interpreting all of them. We've been doing some similar work recently with transformer models and BERT models to try to understand the language in housing listings. So I've worked with a team of qualitative researchers who've hand-coded different themes and topics in housing listings, like racial preferences or gender preferences or unit characteristics or location and amenities. And then we did that on a small subset that takes a few weeks for qualitative researchers to code. And then we're able to train a model to identify those themes in millions of rental listings to let us understand what they look like. So for that project, we're specifically interested in home sharing. That is, I mentioned earlier in this talk, the idea that if you have another tenant sharing a housing unit with you, you're probably selecting based on personal characteristics. So we're testing to see if you actually see a lot more personal characteristics being mentioned in shared listings than you do in whole units for rent. And you very often do. So there's a lot more talk about ethnicity, about gender preferences, about the kinds of jobs they expect you to hold, about drug and alcohol use, that kind of thing. So in that sense, it helps us understand some of those systems by basically letting us scale what were traditionally infeasibly large amounts of work to do in a manual qualitative way by being able to ask it across very large sample sizes with a very large feature space. But at the same time, theorization and practical implications of research are always going to be somewhat invariant, right? You have a problem, you have a question, and the answer should help us have some new knowledge of how cities work or how planners can intervene in them. And whether we do that with AI or whether we do that with OLS, whether we do it with 1,000,000 observations in a sample or 100 observations in a sample, a lot of it still operates the same way. It's just, different tools, different methods, maybe help us answer different questions.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Natalie. I'd first like to say thank you very much for coming and speaking. I really enjoyed this talk. So I'll preface this caveat with like, I've never done like a real housing search pre-internet, but you kind of said that earlier that it kind of is a little bit beneficial to the consumer because it allows us to search based on our preferences a little bit more and to like get out of our geographic silos. Do you think that digitalization though, has kind of been a little bit disadvantaged or a little bit of a disadvantage to the consumer in the fact that like it kind of has reduced the like the competitiveness of the overall unit prices? Like, so I guess from my perspective, the way I got my apartment was that I knew somebody who knew this apartment that wasn't online, and it's like significantly under market value for, or it was for the area that, you know, I lived in. Whereas like when I look online, all of the units in the area are pretty much the exact same price. I don't know if that was the case like before the internet to the extent that it is now, but it seems like I would imagine that, you know, in that way, it's kind of reduced the competitiveness that the consumer has, like, because there's not there, I guess, is more transparency, like the data is so available. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
so
Kind of.
so for your specific example, the way you can think about it is kind of like who gets to be winners or losers in the housing search. So you won the lottery of having a social network where you knew someone who knew someone who got you like a below market rate good unit, right? What that means is someone else who was also on the housing market didn't know the right people and wasn't able to find a similarly attractive unit. The promise of digitalization for the housing market is that you no longer are relying on who you know, where you grew up, you know, those kind of things that are often correlated with other aspects of privileged socioeconomic status. And instead, everyone has access to the same information. So that there's less of, I just drove by the right time on the right day and managed to get the right information that I needed. And instead, we all are kind of starting on more equal footing. That does mean there's a lot more competition over those kind of pocket listings that, you know, people used to have more of a backdoor into sometimes. But the hope is that it means people who were previously disadvantaged in social networking or disadvantaged in knowing those other communities are ideally more able to access the same information that privileged communities were able to.
Well,
I
thank
never did
you.
a housing search pre-internet either, though. My first housing search was on Craigslist, I guess. It was a long time ago, but Craigslist still looked the same then as it does now. I don't really know what it was like. I don't feel like my parents to have to just drive around and look for rent signs or just read in the newspaper. It seems crazy.
Yeah, my unit actually, like, for this company was like family owned, and they were still kind of like in the dark ages. Like they didn't have online listings or anything, and like my brother somehow found them, and so he was like, they're all right. So I was like, okay. And they were like pretty below market, but I have heard, and I'm really grateful that I found them because I've heard of horror stories, like when everybody in my cohort moved to Austin from like out of state, it got to the extent to where they like couldn't even apply for apartments because apartments, like, I guess everything was like so concentrated, you know, on apartments.com or whatever, that like, you know, they were, and maybe this was unique to the Austin housing, you know, situation, but like it just, they were like, there's not even anywhere to apply for an apartment, you know, like, and they were staying in Airbnbs until they could find something. So, but yeah, so
Yeah, yeah, you all are in national news all the time about how crazy the Austin housing market has gotten in the past 5 years. And I will say, as an Angelino, it's only going to get worse. I look at what your asking rents are, or your asking price, your prices are for home sales, and I am just drooling with envy when I see it. You are trending in the wrong direction, but you have plenty of room to keep getting worse until you get like LA.
Well, thank you very much. If there's no more questions, pausing. All right. Well, we really appreciate you coming and chatting and staying with us a little longer to answer some of our questions. So thank you very much, Dr. Boeing.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was really nice getting to chat with you all.
I know, Geoff, we're gonna make a video and we're gonna post online. You can also share with your social media and we'll follow up with the link.
Awesome. Thanks, Feng.
Yeah, good to see you. Bye.
See you.